Good evening, K-Squid listeners. It's every other Sunday again, and you're listening to Sustainability Now, a radio show focused on environment, sustainability, and social justice in the Monterey Bay region, California, and the world. For those of you who might be curious, that initial music comes from Sky Pond, a song performed by American Pica, a person named Greg Duras, who's a musician and mountaineer from Colorado. We're going to be talking about American Picas later on with my guest today, Dr. Joseph Stewart. He's a conservation biologist with special interests in biogeography, prediction, demography, ecophysiology, and climate change. Hi, Joe. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Ronnie. Thanks for having me on.
So, Joe received his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from UC Santa Cruz in 2018, and he's now a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis. He works with the U.S. Forest Service and the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection on forest regeneration after wildfires, a topic of some interest to us in the Santa Cruz area, and the impacts of climate change on biodiversity and species migration. So it's great to have you on the show, Joe. I just want to let our listeners know that when I was provost of Rachel Carson College up on campus, UC campus, Joe came and talked to the Frosh core class a couple of times, and he was a very popular speaker. So, Joe, why don't we start with this question. How did you come to be a postdoc at UC Davis? You know, what's your background, early interests, education, and how did you get into the biodiversity business?
Well, the short answer to how I became a postdoc at UC Davis is that when I was already a graduate student, one of my undergraduate mentors at UC Davis invited me to work on a really cool project, which is updating California's seed transfer guidelines to incorporate climate change. And I was already interested in assisted migration and assisted gene flow in animals, but here was an opportunity to actually implement assisted gene flow for forests, not just talk about it on a theoretical level. So I jumped at the opportunity. I knew the project would be one of the most important things I'd ever have the opportunity to work on. So I formatted and filed my dissertation and started the gig at UC Davis. But before that, I grew up in Santa Cruz. I went to Santa Cruz High, and I spent lots of time exploring our amazing natural heritage and landscapes. And when I started college at UC Davis, I began as a civil engineering major, but quickly realized my interests lay elsewhere. I explored physics, economics, and political science. But when I took my first ecology class, I knew that was what I wanted to do. I was enamored with how complex phenomenon in the natural world could be accurately encapsulated by mathematical models. The same way that Newton's laws in physics tell us with high precision the velocity of falling objects or other things, ecological models could tell us, albeit with less precision, through the trajectories of biological populations and communities. Plus, ecological fieldwork meant I could spend a bunch of time exploring the great outdoors. So I had a blast doing a bunch of entry-level work in things like beekeeping, farming, spotted owl surveys, and vegetation mapping. I was also growing increasingly concerned about climate change. So when I graduated, I actually graduated a quarter early during the 2008 election to organize for strong climate change legislation. I took a job with Greenpeace, where I was the only paid organizer in the entire state of Delaware. I recruited and organized a group of volunteers to pressure the candidates for Congress to support strong climate change legislation. And we came so close to getting a national cap-and-trade law passed at the beginning of the Obama presidency. If it wasn't for the untimely death of Ted Kennedy, we would have had enough votes in the U.S. Senate. But organizing, I think, didn't suit my personality perfectly, and though I'm very glad that I took the time to do that, my interests came back to working in ecology. So I worked for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for a while, doing vegetation and small mammal and bird surveys. I started working with the American Pica when I was working with California Fish and Game. And then ultimately I ended up starting a graduate degree at the University of Nevada, Reno, and then transitioning over to a PhD at UC Santa Cruz.
So there's a lot there to unpack, huh? And I don't even know. Well, I have, of course, I know where to start. But I just wonder. You use that term, I think, aided or assisted gene transfer, something like that. What does that mean?
Yeah, so assisted gene flow is when you take an individual of a species from one part of its existing range and move it to another part of its existing range. And it contrasts with assisted colonization, which is a little bit more controversial and risky, in that instead of moving a species outside of its existing range, which is this assisted colonization, you're taking an individual from one part of its range that possesses a particular set of genetic adaptations and moving it to another part of its range. And the thought is now that we can do that with individuals that from typically the hotter or drier end of the species distribution and move them towards the colder or wetter end of the species distribution in order to move individuals that are pre-adapted to climate change.
Huh. Well, let's come back to that a little bit later because there are a whole bunch of questions that come out of that. What I was wondering was if you could tell us about the connections, since you've been working on post-wildfire regeneration, maybe tell us about how climate and wildfires and utility ineptitude are connected and how climate change might affect California landscapes and biodiversity in the future.
Well, I don't know a ton about utility ineptitude, but I can tell you
No,
about
it's okay. We all know.
climate and wildfires. So wildfires are a pretty dramatic presentation of ecosystem transitions. So right now, high-severity megafires are destroying all the plant life across vast areas. And this makes it very difficult for species that are adapted to more frequent and low-severity fires to regenerate. So after a high-severity fire, the ecosystem can be dramatically reshuffled. Non-native species tend to move in or expand their foothold in the community. And it's also a catalyst for climate to shape the community, since seedlings that are not protected by the canopy of nearby trees can be especially vulnerable to climate extremes. So wildfire is a dramatic example of ecosystem shifts from climate change. But climate change is already affecting ecological communities everywhere. And a recent meta-analysis of hundreds of studies found that half of all species globally have already shifted their ranges in the direction we would expect from climate change. And that involves local extinction at the typically hot and dry end of their distribution, range expansion or colonization at the cold or wet end of their distribution, or both. So prominent examples include salmons, trees, butterflies, caribou, cod and herring. All these species are shifting their distributions, and many more.
Well, some people might say, well, that's what happened at the end of the Ice Age. And so why is it especially problematic now?
Well, because the climate's changing so quickly that many species can't move fast enough in order to keep up with it. The velocity of climate change, the distance that an individual or a species would have to move every year to keep up with the pace of climate change is faster than the species can move. So species either need to adapt in place, which is limited by their standing genetic variation, which, of course, is affected by the climate they've experienced for the last 10,000 years or more, or they need to move, and they simply can't move fast enough to keep up. So a recent meta-analysis estimated that 15% of species globally are vulnerable to extinction from climate change this century. Go ahead.
No, you go on. Sorry. Yeah.
And the number of species that might go extinct from climate change accelerates with the amount of warming we inflict on the planet, of course.
So if you take a species, how under, all else being the same, how quickly does a species expand its territory or where it's found normally? Or is that just something?
That depends on the species, of course, right?
Maybe I'm not asking the
question. Trees have a higher time moving if their seeds are dispersed by winds. But, deer or wolverines or, other more mobile species, birds, of course, can shift their range more easily to keep pace with climate change. The question, of course, is if the resources they depend on, the food sources they depend on, can keep pace with that as well.
I mean, maybe I asked the question. I asked the question rather obliquely. What I meant to say was, how fast would a species range have to move in order to keep up with climate change? You know, assuming it's not going extinct. What are we talking about here?
You know, I don't know the exact answer to that question, but there's a great paper on the subject entitled "The Velocity of Climate Change." And of course, as with many things, the answer depends on where you are in the landscape. If you're in mountainous regions, you can shift relatively short distances on the landscape and increase your elevation in order to keep pace with climate change. But if you're in large flat areas, you have to move much faster. And I think the figure is on the order of like tens of kilometers per year or more.
And so for the species to move, I mean, the species isn't actually picking up, right, and relocating. It has to do with colonization of the niches, I guess, and reproduction as the line, the margin progresses, right? It's something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, you need to have enough juveniles being produced if you're an animal and dispersing north in the right direction. And I mean, of course, they probably don't know that they're supposed to be shifting their distribution in one particular direction. But on the other end, I mean, there's the trailing end of the distribution, so the hot, dry end, typically for a lot of species, where instead of colonization, what you're seeing is local extinction, species disappearing because the conditions have become unsuitable for them anymore. And we're seeing that with a very large number of species globally.
But if the end at which the hotter, drier conditions are developing, right? If that margin is moving more quickly at, let's say, the southern end of the distribution, then the margin of colonization is at the north end. Then eventually, does this become a kind of a squeeze on the population, the species population?
Yeah, certainly. If the suitable climate is expanding less rapidly at the leading edge than at the trailing edge, that can happen. And alpine species are a great example of that, where there might just be no more room to shift up the mountain in order to shift to more suitable climates. But I believe globally we're seeing more local extinctions due to climate change than expansion due to climate change. And that, of course, has to do with it being difficult for species to keep pace.
Yeah, right. Okay. I need to take a break. So, folks, you're listening to Sustainability Now on KSQD 90.7 FM and KSQT.org. That was KSQD.org, streaming on the internet. Over to you, Emily.
Election day is fast approaching. It is sure to be a nail-biter, and KSQD 90.7 FM will be here for you with special election coverage from 3 p.m. until midnight. I am Catherine Bell of the Dream Journal, along with Christine Barrington of Talk of the Bay and Jill Cody of Be Bold America. We will be taking the early shift from 3 to 6 p.m. on November 3rd. We invite you to tune in and keep informed while lowering your stress levels with great guests, joyful music, inspiring ideas, and your calls as we watch together the struggle for America's soul. Turn down corporate media and turn up community media on Election Day by tuning into your station, K-Squid, the station of the people, by the people, and for the people, right here on KSQD 90.7 FM, Community Radio of Santa Cruz. We don't get fooled again. No.
So you're listening to Sustainability Now on KSQD FM. This is Ronnie Lipschutz, and my guest today is Dr. Joseph Stewart, a postdoctoral conservation biologist at UC Davis. We've been talking about species extinction as a result of climate change, and I thought maybe we should shift over to forests because that's where you've been doing your recent research. I was wondering if you can say anything about predictions or projections for the future incidence of forest wildfires before we get to your work?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So a lot of this work is summarized in California's fourth climate change assessment. And I think it's a complicated science predicting these things, but broadly what the projections are for an expanded wildfire season, and we've already been seeing that. Wildfires are starting earlier in the season and going later in the season than previously. The forecasts are for increased area burned per year on the order of about 80% by end century-ish. And that includes wildfires expanding into higher elevations where wildfires have been rare in the past. And notably, increases in large, high-severity fires that leave few, if any, trees alive over pretty broad spatial scales. So increases in the frequency of megafires, so that's really big fires greater than 10,000 hectares in size. That's projected to increase on the order of about 50%. But the speed at which wildfires have expanded and increased over recent years has been largely unanticipated. Part of this has to do with the complex atmospheric phenomenon, like the dry lightning storms that started so many wildfires this summer with its 11,000 lightning strikes, or increased fall winds that make it difficult to make predictions because those things are complicated phenomena that are difficult to include into the models. But yeah, in much the same way that the rate of recent climate change has generally surpassed what previous models projected already, we're seeing high temperatures sooner than we expected. The rates of increases in wildfire seem to also be surpassing what the models forecasted. So part of this probably has to do with the tendency of scientists to be conservative in their predictions, and part of it also just due to the complex atmospheric and ecological processes that can be difficult to anticipate and incorporate into models.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm no atmospheric scientist, but the lightning storm, of course, nobody that I know had ever seen anything quite like that before. And as I recall, it was the result of tropical moisture streaming up from an old tropical storm. And of course, a question was that a result of some change in climate? The other thing, of course, is drought and the drying out of the soil and the landscape, and that combined with the winds. And again, I don't know whether these winds from the east are increasing in frequency, or it's just that the combination of all of these factors, increases the possibility or probability of wildfires. It's a fairly complicated process, I guess, and that's not really what you're working on. So what is it that you do, the work you're doing in forest regeneration? Why don't you tell us about that?
Sure. So I've been looking at how forests regenerate or not after wildfire, and specifically I've been looking at coniferous forests, which is most of what the forests are in California. So conifer species include pines, firs, and redwoods, species with needles and cones. And this is a fun project because I got to work with a huge amount of data from 19 wildfires in California, and with experts from the Forest Service and the U.S. Geological Survey. The problem is that while historically California experienced frequent low-severity wildfires that tended to have smaller spatial extents and create a mosaic of small burned areas on the landscape, oftentimes with the overstory trees surviving, now we're shifting to larger and more severe wildfires. And these larger and more intense wildfires leave huge areas where all the trees have been killed. And this poses a big problem for conifer regeneration, as there can be no nearby seed sources. So if they're left on their own, few if any conifers would regenerate, and the ecosystem would shift to other species, sometimes invasive species, sometimes shifting to shrubs or oaks, sometimes shifting to invasive grasses, which can many of these shifts can actually lead to higher risk of subsequent fires on the landscape afterwards. So it's potentially a problem. Alternatively, the shift towards different vegetation types might be something that we want to let happen because those types might be better suited to future climate. And all of that, of course, depends on exactly where you are in the landscape and what the current and anticipated future climate for those locations is going to be. Another problem is that seedlings can be especially vulnerable to climate extremes, especially when there's no nearby trees to shelter them. So even if seedlings do make it into these areas, they seem to be especially vulnerable to drought. But the Forest Service has a mandate to reforest deforested areas. And of course, their resources are limited, so they want to be planting trees where they're going to get the most bang for their buck. So one aim of this project was to create accurate and an easy-to-use tool to predict where forests are likely to come back on their own and where restoration might be needed most. So in collaboration with the Forest Service, CAL FIRE, USGS, we produced a tool that uses satellite imagery, forest structure maps, climate, and other predictors to create probabilistic maps of conifer regeneration. And these predict the probability within 30-meter cells across the whole spatial extent of a fire and can be available within weeks as soon as we have that satellite imagery after the fire in order to create these maps. And the aim, of course, is to guide reforestation efforts to where they're going to be most useful and needed.
So who collects to identify the dispersal of seeds? You said somebody has to go in and collect data. Is that what you were talking about when you were talking about working with lots of data? That there's actually ground checking of dispersal, or is it just part of the model?
Yeah. So the dispersal component was parameterized using the regeneration data. So how far different species disperse. And there have been some direct studies that have looked at that, and they find that the distance a seed can disperse is related to how tall the tree is. So if a seed it starts off higher and it's blowing at a fixed rate because of the wind, it's going to be able to move further.
Right.
But typically seeds aren't able to move more than 200 meters or so, even from very high seed sources. But yes, we did have a large amount of seed production data that was collected by the USGS over a couple of decades in permanent forest demography plots in the Southern Sierra, and that influenced the variability in annual seed production. So like many other species, including agricultural species, you get massed years with conifers, where some years there's very little seed production, and some years there's gangbusters, just a huge amount of seed production. And that seems to be an evolutionary response to seed predation, right? Like if you drop all of your seeds at once, if the whole forest synchronizes that, you overwhelm the seed predators, the herbivores on the ground, birds and mammals that might be eating those seeds, and you still get some seeds to regenerate there.
Right. How is the seed production correlated then to climate and rainfall?
Yeah, that is a great question. In my own analysis of the data, we didn't include this in the paper or publish on it because the correlation with climate seems to be sort of tricky to entangle. We've got close to 20 years of data there, but even with that, it's difficult to pick out patterns. So
well, we do have
when trees are especially stressed, they can produce a lot more seeds, and that might be one hypothesis.
Really?
Or when, right before a tree dies, just as a last-ditch effort to maintain its genetic lineage, it can put most of its resources into seed production if it expects that the tree itself is not going to survive.
So does drought do that?
It could. I'm pretty sure that there are examples in some tree species where that's been documented.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, of course, the opposite hypothesis is that, when the resources are more plentiful, when there's more precipitation and benign climate conditions, there's more energy to produce seeds. But, most of it has to do with synchronization of, entire forest over pretty large spatial scales. And how this works, I don't think is super well understood. I mean, trees communicate through, molecules in the air. They also communicate through fungal networks underneath the ground. And they might also be responding to particular climate signals, if they have some sort of genetic pre-adaptation to or adaptation to produce seed when they get a particular climate signal early in the season. And it'd be great to understand that more. Before believe me, I was looking for patterns in our data, but I think that the amount of data we need is just we need very long-term studies in order to be able to understand these phenomena.
That's really interesting. Listen, I have one more question before we take another break, and that is, you mentioned that sometimes burned over areas get repopulated by grasses, right? And I can see that grass seeds can blow considerable distances if you have the right condition. But you also mentioned population by oaks, and acorns don't strike me as seeds that would fly very far. So why oaks? How do they get dispersed? Do you have any idea?
Well, I mean, they've got small mammals to assist in moving their seeds around. Probably to a greater extent than coniferous trees in general, I imagine. But of course, small mammals move coniferous seeds around as well. I think the key difference there is that some of these shrubs and some of the oak species tend to have more shrubby growth forms, and some of them tend to have more tree-like growth.
Yeah, sure.
A lot of the oaks tend to stump sprout. So they grow back from the roots. They don't actually need seeds in order to regenerate in these areas.
So, I mean, we're talking then about forests where there are some oaks present, right? And most of it's coniferous, but there is some oak in the forest itself. Is that correct?
Yeah, some of the areas that we're looking at that we surveyed post-fire regeneration for had a considerable oak component, and other of them had less of an oak component.
I see.
Yeah, I mean, it's oftentimes the case where you can have mixed oak and coniferous forests, and oftentimes the conifers will grow taller and oaks will grow in the understory a bit more. And, there's a constant struggle between them, in terms of who's going to dominate the forest. But, a severe fire moving through can be the disturbance that the oaks need to take over the ecosystem.
I wonder if they set their own fires.
Which isn't necessarily bad. People love oaks. I love oaks.
I wonder if they set the fires. Okay, you're listening to Sustainability Now on KSQD 90.7 FM and ksqd.org, streaming on the internet. Over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Ronnie. This Sunday on KSQD, join State of Mind for the first in a series on racism and mental health. We hear directly from Black community members who experience the difficult realities of racism and the detrimental effects it has on their mental health. Join guest host Gail Borkowitz, activist Joy Flynn, educator and musician Lisa Taylor, and psychologist Dr. Robert Barty as they share insights gleaned from their personal and professional experiences in our community. They discuss how racism is a very real daily force and the complex and subtle forms it takes right here in our community. Part 2, next month, will look at the impacts of racism on access to physical and mental health services and ways to overcome these barriers for people of color. That's State of Mind, Sunday evening at 6 p.m. here on KSQD 90.7 FM and ksqd.org. Now, back to you, Ronnie.
You're listening to Sustainability Now. I'm Ronnie Lipschutz, and my guest today is Dr. Joseph Stewart. He's a postdoctoral fellow at UC Davis, studying forest regeneration after wildfires. and the impacts of climate change on biodiversity and species migration. I was just interrogating Joe about his research and some questions about how forests, different species regenerate. Joe, one of the questions I have is: are you doing just modeling, modeling of these patterns, or are you doing any kind of field work as well? I mean, in terms of regeneration.
Yeah, I mean, so there is a fieldwork component to my seed transfer project. So after fires, working with the Forest Service, we're planting seed sources from a variety of different locations and climate. And the intent there is to see which seed sources perform the best. But yeah, largely, my work over recent years has shifted to more modeling and less field work. I'm still out in the field doing work with pikas a little bit, but I've scaled back on that. So I'd love to be in the field a fair amount more, but I think, the biggest impact I can have, given my skill set, is with some of the ecological modeling work and piecing together all of this data. I sort of found with my work with Fish and Wildlife and other agencies that, everybody loves to collect data, but what to do with that data can be a little bit more tricky. Proper interpretation of the data and careful statistical analysis, I think, is an area where you can have bigger bang for your buck in terms of, the amount of impact you can make.
Yeah, that's an interesting problem, and we could get off on that. I wanted to ask, so the Forest Service, right, has a responsibility to reforest burned over areas. And does it usually do that by putting in seedlings or by scattering seeds?
I think it's mostly by planting seedlings. So right now, I'm consulting with CAL FIRE on what seeds to start germinating, growing, to be planted out, I think next year. So right now they're doing the stratification and other steps. They're putting the seeds in a freezer in order to expose them to enough cold in order to get them to germinate, and then they'll start growing them out in a greenhouse. And then those will be planted out. So the timeline that foresters need to work with is, planning a fair amount in advance for what sort of seeds they're going to plant where. So they need data as soon as they can on where reforestation is going to be an important tool to use.
So basically you're looking at which seeds sprout most readily, right, in these conditions, and then from that growing the seedlings, deciding which seedlings to grow and plant, right? Is that how it works?
Yeah, well, so germination rates are not something that I've been incorporating into my models right now. Most of the data that we're working with in terms of seed transfer comes from experiments where, the seeds are already germinated and, 1-year-old or 2-year-old seedlings are planted in the ground. The big signals that we're seeing in terms of those species are rate of growth, so how quickly does the tree grow, and then survival. How likely is the tree to survive given the new climate that it's planted in.
What are the survival rates?
It varies depending on a variety of factors. So I don't have those figures on the top of my head.
Okay.
But really what I'm looking at is relative survival, right? So relative to the optimum. So if you take seeds from 60 different sources, 60 different climates, and you plant them all in one common garden, which one does the best, and how do the rest of them perform relative to that optimum one?
I see.
And what we're finding, of course, is that seeds that are well matched in terms of climate perform the best, because trees, as it turns out, tend to have a fairly high degree of local climate adaptation. Seeds from colder parts of a species range are adapted to those cold conditions, and seeds from hotter parts of a species range are adapted to those hotter conditions.
So you can't really rely on seeds from one part of the range to grow in another. Is that what you mean?
Well, that's been the traditional approach, right? Is to get seeds as locally as possible throughout all of restoration ecology, right? Because you want those seeds to be adapted to the environment in which they're planted. But with climate change, the climate of the past that trees are adapted to in a particular location is not the current climate, and it's not the future climate.
Right.
With the data that we're looking at, you can see, depending on the species, anywhere between like a 5 to 40% decline in productivity, and that's integrating both growth rates and survival for forests, if you just go with the traditional approach of using local seed. In order to help forests keep pace with climate change, it looks like assisted gene flow is going to be an important strategy there.
Well, let's talk about that. So let's get back to this idea of assisted gene flow. I mean, I know that some scientists have proposed this as a strategy in response to species extinction and climate change. And how successful has that been so far? I mean, it's early, but what is the success rate? Have you any idea?
Well, maybe I should just back up and just sort of give sort of broader information on
that'd be good. Yeah.
Assisted gene flow versus assisted colonization. So there's two very different things that we're looking at. So assisted colonization is moving species from one location to another location outside of that species' existing range. And that can be more risky ecologically if the species turns out to have negative consequences or turns out to be invasive in that new environment. So examples of big negative consequences include Burmese pythons in the Everglades, the brown tree snake in Guam, which has been implicated in extinction of at least a couple different bird species and near extinction of some other cane toads in Australia, and agricultural pests. So assisted colonization can be risky.
But we're talking there about bringing species from far, far away, right, into new ecosystems. Isn't that right? But what if you're trying to do assisted colonization? With one of the things you've been researching, let's just say the lizard, the spotted lizard, right? Leopard lizard. Yeah. So I mean, what if you were to try and, let's just say, assist it in moving north from its current range? Why would that end up being invasive and detrimental to the adjacent ecology?
Well, if you're moving the species within its existing or historical range, that wouldn't be assisted colonization. That would be assisted gene flow. And so that's when you take individuals from one part of a species range and move them to another part of the range where the species already exists.
I see. Okay. And that's what you're doing. That's what you're trying. I mean, that's what the goal of your project, your research, right?
Yeah,
the people
that's what
you're
we're
working
doing
with.
Trees.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And I guess then my question is a sort of philosophical one, and why do you think we're responsible for actually assisting species to move? I mean, it's true. It's true. We're wiping them out. I mean, I don't argue with that as a undesirable consequence of what we're doing, but what's the underlying logic of doing this? And I'm not trying to chastise you or anything like that. I'm just curious how you think about that.
Well, there's so many different reasons. I mean, one of them is that we want to leave livable and nice planet that, still has much of the biodiversity that we inherited for future generations. Another one is economic, of course. So California, for instance, has, I think, $1.4 billion in revenue from timber products on an annual basis. So if you are able to keep that from declining by 5 or 10 or 20%, you get a considerable increase in the amount of wood that's produced, which means that you have to cut down trees over a larger area, or over a smaller area, so you can use less land to meet your timber production needs. For assisted colonization, you're also getting more carbon sequestration in those forests. So you're helping to mitigate climate change. And you're producing forests that have less dead trees in them, which are, nicer to walk through and more pleasant on the eyes.
Well, of course, that raises the whole question of clearing out the underbrush, right? If you don't do that, then it's much harder to walk through the forests. And I won't say who told us to go get rakes. Why don't we shift? There's another break coming up, but why don't we talk? I'd like to talk about the American pika, because I know that was one of the things that you were doing research on, and they're pretty cute little critters. So why don't you tell us what they are and what the problems are that are facing them, and what sorts of what you found out?
Yeah, so pikas are related to rabbits and hares. They're super cute, and they're about the size of hamsters. They're super well adapted to cold conditions, and they typically live in relatively cold environments. So adaptations include a thick coat of fur, including on the bottom of their feet and the inside of their ears, and a relatively high resting metabolic rate that acts as a furnace to help them keep cold during winter conditions. But the same adaptations that help them stay warm in the winter also make them vulnerable to overheating in the summer. So when summer temperatures are too high, they have to spend more time underground to avoid overheating. And this translates to less time spent foraging for food, or if they choose to be active at night, we think potentially higher risk of predation at night, getting eaten by an owl or a coyote or a weasel.
Yeah.
And as a result, lower elevation, warmer populations have begun to go locally extinct as temperatures have become too warm for them. So part of my PhD research was resurveying historical pika sites across California. These are sites where pikas were observed at some point in the past, and there's a record of them, maybe at the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology or something along those lines. And a lot of these sites come with detailed field notes. You can retrace the steps of where past ecologists found pikas, and sometimes they come with historical photos. You can print out these historical photos and walk through the landscape and try to line up the mountains in just the right way to be sure that you're exactly at the historical site. But we surveyed 67 historical sites across California. 10 of them, or 15%, turned out to be locally extinct. And we resurveyed these sites exhaustively to confirm that pikas were really gone. This involved searching all habitat within 1 kilometer of the historical site and coming back over subsequent years to confirm they were really extinct, that we weren't just, failing to detect them if there were still a few pikas hanging on. And the best predictors of where they were gone tended to be lower elevation and warmer sites, and sites with less pika habitat, consistent with exactly what we would expect from climate change.
I have to take a break, and we'll come back and talk about the pika some more in just a minute or so. Folks, you're listening to KSQD 90.7 FM, your community radio station, and ksqd.org, streaming on the internet. Emily?
As we often say here at KSQD, we are many voices at one station, but we need each other. You need us to keep you informed and connected to our community through the good times and the bad times. And we need you to listen and contribute, to keep us up to date on what's happening out there in the real time that only radio can provide. But we also need your financial contribution to keep us on the air 24/7. Please donate by visiting ksqd.org and clicking on Support.
You're listening to Sustainability Now on KSQD 90.7 FM and ksqd.org, streaming on the internet. This is Ronnie Lipschutz, and my guest today is Dr. Joseph Stewart. He's a conservation biologist at UC Davis, doing work on forest regeneration after wildfires, on the impacts of climate change on biodiversity and species migration. So getting back to the American pika, I was wondering, are there places where there have been sightings where there weren't sightings in the past?
That is a great question. In my own explorations, I've often found that the upper elevational limit for pikas is the glaciers, essentially. So when glaciers melt, pikas can move into that area that's no longer covered by glaciers. I know at least one study has found that, moderate elevations for pikas tend to have the highest population densities, and that the highest elevations and lowest elevations both have lower population densities.
Which makes sense.
From that you can extrapolate that climate towards the highest elevations, the coldest areas, might be a little bit below their optimum, but it's still within the range that they're typically able to inhabit. I don't know that there's been any research that has actually documented colonization of pikas into, at least in the American pika, into new areas where they weren't found before. And I think that's because pikas typically, at least here in California and throughout most of the western, or at least lower western United States, already live at the highest elevations that are available to them in the mountains.
Well, when I was doing research, to figure out what to talk about, I came upon something called the Pika Citizen Science Survey. Is that still operating, and what is it, or was it?
I think so, and some of my colleagues have been involved in that work, and there might actually be a couple different Pika Citizen Science surveys going on. I know there's, I think, one going on the Front Range of Colorado, and I think some other citizen science efforts. Pikas are a great species for citizen science work. One, because, they're super cute. They live in incredibly gorgeous areas. So it's relatively easy to attract volunteers who are enthusiastic about spending time with the pikas, but also because they've got pretty high detectability. They're pretty vocal. So if you're not finding pikas there, you can have reasonably high confidence that the pikas actually aren't at that site. And of course, that depends on survey methods. If you're doing a more involved survey, you're probably getting into their habitat. They live in these broken rock debris fields, known as talus, that can be a little bit treacherous to navigate, right? Because, you could knock a rock over and hurt yourself in the process of scrambling through these areas. But pika poop tends to be pretty easy to detect and also very persistent. So because they've got high lignin content and because they're sheltered by these broken rock debris fields, you can have pika poop that lasts for decades or longer existing in these talus fields. And we've actually used that. We've carbon dated these very old pika poops to look at the timeline of where pikas existed in the past, how long ago it was that they were at these sites, and then where they are now. And we applied that to the Tahoe region, where we found one of the largest areas of pika local extinction that has been documented to date. The whole area around Mount Pluto, sort of south of Truckee and north of of Lake Tahoe, in between the main crest of the Sierra Nevada and then the the Carson Range on the east side there. That whole area used to have pikas, and from our carbon dating, we know that they disappeared first at the lowest elevations, consistent with when local temperature records show that temperatures were starting to get too warm with them, persisted at the very top of Mount Pluto as recently as 1955 or so, and then became extinct. It looks like because the climate became too warm for them there.
I have to say that no one your age would say 1955 is recent, although it is for me. So let me just ask one more question about this. So basically, pika do not live in places where people are likely to build houses or do other development, right?
Oh, I mean, they're generally yes, but in some locations, yeah. I mean, so like up on Donner Summit, there are some houses, at elevations. But typically, they're in sort of more rugged terrain where people would build houses. Largely where pikas exist, they're in, wilderness or relatively undisturbed areas. So we can be pretty certain that it's climate, not other factors, not other human factors that are causing them to disappear.
Just one more question about the citizen survey. I kind of got the impression, looking at it, that it was for people reporting sightings on their, travels through the mountains. This is actually organized, volunteers organized to go out and look in particular places?
Yeah, so you'd have to talk to the Front Range Pika Project about that. I'd be happy to talk with people if people want to look for pikas. I have a long list and maps of locations where I'd love for people to look for pikas, where it takes enough time to get to these places and to hike to them that of course I'm not able to survey all of the locations that I'd like to. So it'd be great to have citizen scientists, and I'd invite people who are strongly interested in doing that to reach out and ask where data would be most useful.
So, listeners, you hear that. Joseph Stewart would be happy to help people go out and look for pikas. I'll give you his website just before the end of the show, so you can look up his contact information. Then I want to in our last few minutes, I want to change to an entirely different topic, and this has to do with your profession. Because as I said, some years ago you gave some presentations to the Frosch class at Rachel Carson College at UC Santa Cruz, and I remember that after your talks, the numbers of students who came up to talk to you about their interest in doing that kind of conservation and restoration biology research was pretty impressive. And I guess that was because there were a lot of students who wanted to do biology in the Rachel Carson Frosch body. But I was wondering, does that still happen to you when you give talks?
Yeah, I had a bunch of students from your class who wanted to know how to get involved in ecological research, and a few of them even ended up doing some volunteer work with pikas. Yeah, and so I mean, working with pikas has been great because, as I said before, it's relatively easy to excite people to work with them. So I've been very lucky to get to ride the pikas' coattails in that respect. But I've been giving fewer talks to undergraduate and broader public audiences since I became a postdoc.
Right.
I can't say there's a great reason why. I'd love to continue to do that. I've just been less involved in it since I've switched universities.
It's professional conferences all the way down, isn't it? And workshops and mostly. Students don't attend those kinds of things. It's pretty obvious. The populations, right? The impacted populations have declined. They're not extinct, but they're not in your range anymore. Is there anything
lots of foresters and scientists, though.
Yeah. Is there anything I left out that you'd like to bring up in the last few minutes?
Oh, I mean, golly, just the assisted gene flow for trees, I think, is really exciting. In the past, I've worked on species where it's less clear what the solutions to climate change are, but with trees and moving them around, here's an opportunity to really have an impact. So that's been really exciting for me, and I think potential to have a big positive impact across the state.
Well, okay. So thanks very much, Joe, for being my guest on Sustainability Now.
Thank you so much, Ronnie.
You're welcome. You can find out more about Joe and his research at stewartecology.org, and that will lead you in all kinds of directions, to scientific papers and various other sorts of topics. And as you heard, if you're interested in stalking the wily pika, he's happy to talk to you about that. My guest in 2 weeks will be Beverly Deschaux, president of the Electric Auto Association of the California Central Coast. We're going to talk about electric vehicles, past, present, and future, and how they might become an electricity storage solution to the ups and downs of the California electrical grid. We'll also be talking about something called virtual power plants, which are based on the aggregation and remote control and monitoring of things like rooftop solar panels and electric vehicles as part of managing the electricity grid. So that's on Sunday, November 15th, from 5 to 6 p.m. right here on KSQD 90.7 FM and ksqd.org, streaming on the internet, your ink spot on the radio dial. And so as a reminder, for those of you who get up with the sun, and since today was a time change, the sun is going to come up earlier, shows from the 5 to 6 p.m. Sunday slot are rebroadcast the following Tuesday mornings. That's going to be Election Day, from 6 to 7 a.m. And if you'd like to listen to previous Sustainability Now broadcasts, you can find them at ksqd.org/Sustainability Now, and on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Pocket Casts, among other podcast sites. I want to give my thanks to Emily Dunham for today's excellent engineering, and to everyone else at the station who makes this show possible. So until next every other Sunday, Sustainability Now.